He was not a young man standing defiant against an empire. By the time they threw him into that pit, he was likely in his 80s, a man who had already survived one empire's collapse and was about to survive a night that should have killed him twice over. This is the story of Daniel, but not the version most people have heard. To understand what happened in that pit, you have to understand how unlikely it was that Daniel was even still alive to see it. Decades earlier, as a teenager, Daniel had been taken captive from Jerusalem when the Babylonian Empire conquered his homeland. He grew up in a foreign court, serving kings who worshipped foreign gods, somehow rising, against every likelihood, to become one of the most trusted advisors in the empire. He outlived King Nebuchadnezzar. He outlived the fall of Babylon itself. And now, in his final years, under yet another ruler, in yet another empire, he found himself facing the greatest threat of his life, not because of anything he had done, but because of exactly who he had remained, year after year, decade after decade. The new king was Darius the Mede, who ruled over the kingdom of Babylon after the Persians rose to power. Historians and biblical scholars have long debated exactly who Darius the Mede was within the wider historical record of the period. Some identify him with a governor appointed under Cyrus the Great, others with a co-regent ruling in the Medo-Persian transition. What the text makes clear is that he inherited a vast, newly conquered territory, and he needed men he could trust to hold it together. Darius organized his vast territory under a structure of 120 regional governors, called satraps, spread across the entire breadth of the empire, overseen by 3 chief administrators who reported directly to the king. Daniel was one of those 3, and he distinguished himself so clearly, so consistently in the way he carried out his duties, that the king began considering placing him above all the others, over the entire kingdom. That single piece of news was enough to turn the other officials against him. It's worth pausing here to consider what that promotion actually meant. Daniel was not a young man building a career. He had already lived through the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, had already survived the violent collapse of the entire Babylonian Empire, had already adapted, decade after decade, to serve under rulers who did not share his faith. And now, in what should have been the quiet final chapter of a long life, he was being handed more power and more visibility than he had ever held before, which meant he also had more to lose than he ever had before. There's something about watching a person of real integrity rise that makes people who lack it deeply uncomfortable. If you've ever felt punished simply for doing things the right way, while everyone around you cut corners, you already understand what Daniel was up against. Stay with me, because the trap they built for him was clever enough to fool a king, and what Daniel did when he learned about it will tell you everything about who he really was. The administrators and satraps searched for a way to bring charges against Daniel in his handling of the kingdom's affairs. They combed through his decisions, his records, his conduct, looking for even the smallest inconsistency they could use against him. But they could find nothing. No corruption, no negligence, no failure of any kind. Daniel was too faithful, too consistent for any of it to work, so they changed their strategy entirely. If they couldn't find a fault in how Daniel governed, they would find one in how he worshipped, because that, they knew, was the one part of his life he would never be willing to compromise. They went to King Darius together, a united front of officials, and presented their proposal, framed carefully as flattery rather than a trap. Let the king establish a decree, they said, that anyone who prays to any god or man other than you, your majesty, for the next 30 days, shall be thrown into the lion's den. It appealed to exactly the kind of vanity a new king in an unstable empire might feel drawn toward: total, undivided loyalty from every corner of his territory. They convinced Darius to put it in writing, urging him to sign it quickly, before he had time to think too carefully about who it might affect. And here is a detail most retellings leave out entirely. Once a decree was written into the law of the Medes and Persians, it could not be changed or revoked, not even by the king himself. This wasn't superstition or poetic language. It was an actual legal principle of the empire, a safeguard meant to give royal law permanence and authority. The officials knew this. It's precisely why they built their trap this way. Once Darius signed it, there would be no way for him to undo it, no matter what happened next. Daniel heard about the new decree. Everyone in the administration heard about it almost immediately, since it had just been signed into permanent law across the entire kingdom. And he did something remarkable in its sheer ordinariness. He went home, and he prayed, exactly as he always had. 3 times a day, kneeling by an open window facing toward Jerusalem, a specific detail the text preserves carefully, echoing an old prayer of King Solomon's asking that God would hear the prayers of his people whenever they turned toward that city, even from exile in a foreign land. Daniel gave thanks to God there, just as he had done for as long as anyone in that household could remember. He didn't hide. He didn't close the window. He didn't change a single habit of a lifetime, because a new law had just made it illegal. The officials, who had clearly been watching his house for exactly this, found him praying at the window and rushed to the king, almost triumphant. They had waited for this moment for weeks, some of them likely watching Daniel's window from a distance each evening, counting on the one thing about him that had never changed in all the years they'd known him. "Did you not sign a decree?" they asked Darius, "that anyone who prays to any god or man besides you would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king confirmed that he had. "Then Daniel," they said, "who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." Darius was distressed when he heard the accusation, because by then he understood exactly what had happened to him. He had been maneuvered into signing away the life of the one advisor he trusted most. He spent the rest of the day trying to find some way around the law to save Daniel, but the officials reminded him no decree of the Medes and Persians could be altered. As evening came, the king had no choice but to give the order. Daniel was brought to the mouth of a pit, and it's worth understanding what that pit actually was. Lions held real symbolic and practical importance across Mesopotamian royal culture. Kings of the region were known to keep lions for hunts and to display royal power, and pits or dens for holding dangerous animals were not unusual features of a royal court. This wasn't some improvised punishment. It was a very real, very deliberate death sentence, using animals the empire already had on hand for exactly this kind of use. Before Daniel was lowered into the den, Darius spoke to him directly, his voice carrying something closer to a plea than a royal decree. "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." Then a stone was placed over the mouth of the pit, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the rings of his nobles, so that nothing could be changed regarding Daniel. A final, almost desperate gesture from a king who wanted no one, not even himself, to tamper with what he had just been forced to do. Darius returned to his palace that night, and the record tells us something unusually personal about a Near Eastern king, that he refused to eat, refused any music or entertainment brought to comfort him, and could not sleep. Instead, he spent the entire night pacing in genuine anguish over what he had allowed to happen to the one advisor he trusted above all others. For a king with absolute power over an empire, it must have been an unbearable thing to understand so clearly that his own signature had condemned an innocent man, and that no power he held could undo it. An elderly man, sealed in a pit with lions through the coldest hours of the night, and a king pacing his palace in guilt until morning. If stories about integrity costing everything and still somehow not being the end are the kind of stories you want more of, this is exactly why this channel exists. Stay with me, because what Darius found at first light is the reason this story has survived for thousands of years. At the first light of dawn, Darius got up and hurried to the den, still anxious, still holding on to whatever hope was left. When he reached the pit, his voice was filled with anguish as he called out, "Daniel, servant of the living God," he shouted, "has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" And from inside the pit, a voice answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." Darius was overjoyed. He gave orders for Daniel to be lifted out of the den immediately, and when they examined him, they found no wound of any kind on his body. Not a scratch, not a mark, nothing. An old man had spent an entire night sealed in a den with lions and walked out completely unharmed. The king then ordered that the men who had conspired against Daniel be brought and thrown into the den in his place, along with their families. And this time, the text tells us plainly, the lions overpowered them before they even reached the floor of the pit. A stark, sobering contrast to what Daniel had just survived, making clear that what protected Daniel that night was not luck, and not the mercy of hungry animals, but something entirely outside the ordinary rules of that pit. Afterward, Darius wrote to every people and nation under his rule, declaring that everyone in his kingdom should fear and reverence the God of Daniel. A God, he wrote, who rescues and delivers, who works signs and wonders, and who had saved Daniel from the power of the lions. What makes this story remarkable isn't a miracle happening to someone brand new to their faith, desperate and searching for the first time. It's that it happened to a man in his final years, who had already spent an entire lifetime, decades, under multiple empires, through the rise and fall of kings, quietly doing the same small, faithful things, whether or not anyone was watching, whether or not it was legal, whether or not it cost him everything. Daniel didn't survive that night because he did something dramatic. He survived it because he had already spent a lifetime doing something small and consistent long before that particular night ever arrived. Maybe that's worth sitting with. The version of courage that actually holds up under pressure is rarely built in a single dramatic moment. It's built in the ordinary evenings, the ones nobody else sees, when you choose to keep doing the right thing simply because it's who you've decided to be. If this story gave you something to carry with you today, stay close. There are more stories like this one waiting for you, stories about faith that held steady when everything else gave way. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you there.